So welcome. I'm so excited to see you this Saturday morning. I don't know all the locations where you're coming from, but I know one of our presenters is in Hawaii, so it's 6 a.m. I know we probably have some people. I know Adriana's on the East Coast, so it's noon. And then Lisa's in Central Time Zone. So we have people all over the country. I don't know if we have any international or islands. Well, we have Hawaii, but like Guam or any place else. But hello, everyone. And let me get the number. We have 36 people. And I'm going to put you in groups of 3 for just 5 minutes. And our topic today is narrative research. So I want you to talk you just 5 minutes. You'll have to talk quick and be collaborative, give other people space to talk. But what you know about narrative research or what you want to know?
Be here and enjoy this nice warm weather at the beach that you're having.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I see some great alums. Dr. Curran. All right, welcome back. So we don't want to spend too much time, but just a few popcorns. What do you know about narrative research, or what do you want to know? Just quick 1-sentence statements.
Hi, this is Lisa. I know that it's related potentially to grounded theory overall, and I'd like to know how to go into it as a researcher with a lens, but that's not impacting the responses.
Okay, how to get good, we call it rich description when you have a good interview. And that's what you want. You want someone's story. You want their voices in narrative research. Couple more sentences, what you know or what you want to know.
Just excited to hear how the stories evolve over. We talked about generations and different times, and yeah, the richness of the stories.
All right. Anybody else?
Framing the question to get the results and to tap into that unknown through the question.
We're going to do some of that. You'll see the research questions of our illustrious panel, but we're not necessarily going to make the whole thing about the question, but we'll help. We'll help with that. Anyone else?
Well, I will just say that it's been many, many years since I've looked at the literature on narrative research, but I'm very drawn to it. And because it has been so long, I probably need just a quick basic refresher.
Okay, great. Well, we'll do some basics on the epistemology. Yes, so we can help you with that. Okay, let's pick one more and then we'll get started with the program.
Some of us are working with other younger generations, particularly to break down some of the barriers of communication and misunderstanding, find ways that we can collaborate together on some of the issues. And we're finding storytelling is something that young people relate to as a way of breaking those down. So I'm looking forward to learning more about what you all have learned.
Great. Yeah, I talk about storytelling being ancient human technology. Even, and we often talk about storytelling in indigenous folks, which of course, that epistemology, indigenous epistemology, holds so much about storytelling. But if you think about the planet, and you think about caves in Europe or fires in Africa, or the plains of Mongolia, elders have been telling stories from the dawn of time. So it's an ancient human technology for passing on culture, values, behaviors, and also to hear and to help people merge with these threads throughout human civilization. Okay, so we'll get on unless someone has a burning sentence to share before we start. Yes, no, maybe.
Well, I don't know burning, but I really want to hope that we're going to touch on, I'm from the US Virgin Islands and my research is in the US Virgin Islands for my dissertation using narrative inquiry. Of course, it lends itself more to storytelling, but I hope we're going to touch on how to really make that strong case for the IRB, that the best way to bring forward this research is through the stories, specifically in like agriculture and the farmers, et cetera. And
Right.
our IRB is really strongly leans towards quantitative. So I'm really trying
Okay.
to just make a good case for it.
Okay, and Joanne, you're an alum, right? Right.
Yeah, actually, University of the Virgin Islands had a partnership with Fielding. And so I
Oh.
got my graduate certificate through Fielding while working on my PhD coursework.
I
But
see.
now I'm at the dissertation phase with the PhD.
I see. So a
How do
PhD
you
candidate.
recognize me?
Yeah, your name seems so familiar.
Oh,
Um,
oh boy.
But we're not going to dive a lot in IRB, but I am the chair of Fielding Graduate University's IRB. So I'm so happy to set up a Zoom afterwards about how to get that through the IRB, because they're not supposed to mess with design. They're supposed to protect human subjects. So there's a way of getting participant stories. Okay, well, we'll start the program and norms today. If you could just make sure you're muted unless you're talking. And I would kind of like to keep the chat quiet until we're done with the panel. The panel members can ask if they want questions in the chat, and I'll monitor them. But sometimes as a presenter, I have a hard time keeping track of the chat and also talking. But let me just do a few slides to get started. So the topic today is narrative research, getting the story and finding the themes. So I'm quoting myself, so we can criticize me with the hubris of quoting oneself, but I really like this quote. But narrative research studies the whole person in context and examines whole lives. Stories convey information in present time sense and include a felt sense. That's the issue with storytelling. It comes from the heart of the teller and the heart of the listener, giving new perspectives and clarity to understanding experiences. The patterns in research, you're looking for patterns. The patterns of these experiences become apparent. And I'm using narrative and storytelling interchangeably, and I'll talk about that in a little bit to make sure you understand when I use those both together. But storytelling taps unconscious emotional material and memories that contain salient content about an event. And then my guru for narrative research is Omnia Lieblich. She's in Israel. This is somewhat of a dated book, but it's if you're a Fielding student, and maybe Sage, this is kind of a Sage classic book, Sage publication. And so usually you can get this book on the internet. I believe it's out of print now, but I like some of her quotes. People are storytellers by nature. Stories provide coherence to one's experience and have a central role in communication with others. And this is one of the clearest channels for learning about the inner world through verbal accounts and stories. Now, today we're just talking about qualitative research. And there's a woman, Rossman, who has a book on designing qualitative research, and she uses the word qualitative genres. The qualitative research shares an epistemology that we're diving into a phenomena to open the black box of that phenomena. And so we're looking at humans in context. We're not reductionistic and pulling out a specific thing to measure. So all of these genres share that epistemology. But I think each of the qualitative genres kind of privileges a certain way of knowing. So let's look at a Venn diagram, right? So we have qualitative research, qualitative epistemology, humans in context. And within that Venn diagram, we have these little circles, and some of them overlap. The thing about qualitative research is we're constructivistic in the sense that we feel like we're creating knowledge with our participants. And so I just put each of these genres has a rich tradition, and one should, like, if you want to use phenomenology, you need to dive into that. So I just put something in parens to kind of anchor it. So maybe you could see a little bit of a difference. That phenomenology is interested in the lived experience. We have action research and participant action research, and that's about participation of the research with the participant. We have hermeneutics, which is about texts. The Jewish scholars studying the Torah and reading iterative process over and over about the Torah to find out some themes. That's what we mean by text. But I had one student who used hermeneutics with her dreams. So she would write down her dreams and study the text of her dreams. Grounded theory is about opening up a phenomena. The researcher doesn't have prejudgment. Case study, the main thing to look at with case study is there's multiple data sources. And of course, ethnography comes from anthropology. So you're looking at a phenomena within the social and cultural context. A number of our students at Fielding are using autoethnography, and then you're evoking memories from your own life and writing about that. But we're talking about narrative today. And narrative is about listening to voices. So it began in the women's movement. You remember those conscious raising womanist groups with Gloria Steinem, that women didn't feel like their voices were heard. It's now been championed by Black feminist researchers that Black women's voices have not been heard. And we also hear it with LGBTQ folks. Their voices haven't been heard. And some of the research you'll hear just shortly, you'll be interested in the different populations they worked with. Dr. V will be working with Gen Z kids about their, well, they're not kids, sorry. Yeah, emerging adults is the right word right now, about their racial identity. And Adriana Perez, Dr. Perez is going to be talking about leaders. And you would think, well, executives in a health enterprise, we've heard their voices, but we haven't heard how they became an executive. And then we'll also hear from almost Dr. Elliott. She just needs to be published in ProQuest. She'll be talking about executives or people in organizations that have had a spiritual transformation and how they bring that in the workplace. And we haven't really heard those voices. And then Maine, PhD candidate Maine Castro, she's working with a lot of Native folks, but other folks from Hawaii and partially from the mainland about how they've kept out of prison post-incarceration. How do they talk story, which is a Hawaiian cultural concept, to stay out of prison? Okay, so I introduced them, but here you go. And we'll start with Dr. Verleza.
Hi, good morning. I hope everybody can hear me. If you are unmuted, would you mind muting? I'm getting some feedback. So I'm Dr. Victoria Verleza. I use pronouns she and her, and I studied the emerging adults technically, but for the dissertation and the title, I'm calling them Gen Z. So I examined who am I? Social media's impact on racial identity development of Gen Z. So this particular idea came to me while I was teaching undergraduate students in a tech and media class. So I was teaching human development, technology, and the media, and it became very apparent, this was 2 years ago, 2019, it became very obvious that social media impacts how Gen Z sees themselves and how they're learning or not learning through other accounts. This became much more obvious in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and it became more obvious to the white population, if I'm being honest. So my research question worked a lot with Annabelle on this because I am rooted in storytelling. I am a storyteller, and I believe that people giving voice to their own experience is very important. My research question was, what stories do emerging adults tell themselves about how social media impacts their racial identity development? So me, myself, I am passionate about social justice, racial justice, and how people navigate their identities with their assumed and perceived identities. So not everything you see is what's true. And this became very obvious when I was interviewing mixed race folks or biracial folks or multiracial folks. Somebody's still unmuted, just so you know. And the thing that was important to me was to let folks have an opportunity to share their story in its entirety, but me as the researcher not elicit the story that I think that should be told. So I was faculty at the time, and I've been working with college students for over a decade. And I felt like narrative was a fit because I personally am invested in storytelling, as I said, especially as it relates to identity. People want to tell their stories, and that was very obvious in these interviews. I interviewed 17 people. They were between the ages of 18 and 29, which is emerging adults, and the majority of them fall within the Gen Z population. So what was really interesting was I found that social media is a learning tool for white people and is a tool of validation and representation for folks who are not white. Black folks specifically talked quite a bit about finding representation. Mixed race folks talked a lot about how they finally were able to see themselves through different accounts. The accounts that were talked about the most were Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, not Facebook. And these are my example questions. So this was really tough for a lot of them. But the first question, tell me, are you firm in your identity? Do you feel like you understand who you are at the core? It was tough. Everybody started with, wow, that's really deep. But I was able to build a rapport very quickly with these people. So the semi-structured questions elicited rich and full stories. I was not married to asking all of the 20 questions I had because I knew them well enough that we could just have a conversation. I never filled silence. I allowed silence to just sit because they continued to talk. All of the questions were pointed toward what I wanted. So I had 3 buckets of questions. So the first one is from the emerging adult bucket, and the second question is from my third bucket, which is around race. And that question is, tell me about the first time you felt different from others. Where were you? Who was there? And what was happening? These questions were designed to have folks recall the first time they felt different. The stories that came from this particular question really helped guide my findings. So while I was taking notes, I also had my recorder on my phone. And while I was taking notes, I was writing timestamps on the side. So I knew when I was transcribing what I wanted to compare. With that, I went through my notebook that never left my side because I was terrified. I was color coding. So after the 17 interviews that took place over 5 different days over 3 months, I was very intentional about putting the interviews back to back, if I could, because the themes, the codes, all of the connections sort of just emerged by themselves because I was doing these interviews so closely together. I was taking color coding, different color pens, circling things, writing things out. And then after I transcribed, I put everything into themes and then major themes, minor themes. It was pretty fantastic. I remember being very excited by what was coming up and feeling very full because every interviewee mentioned at the end, thank you for letting me tell you my story from my lens. Because they're college students, I wasn't sure what stories were going to come about, but some themes that emerged that were completely unexpected had to do with sexuality, had to do with religion, had to do with different otherings in terms of how they navigate their own race, their perceived race, and how other people assume they identify. It was pretty remarkable how rich they were. Everybody went an hour, which I sort of planned for. I wasn't really expecting people to get so deep into their stories, but they were very firm in telling me who they think they are. And just for you all moving forward, I used a pre-survey to collect demographic information. I did not ask anyone specific, like, are you white? Are you Black? Are you this? I didn't ask that question. I said, how would you define your race? How would you define your ethnicity? Because those are two different things. And I very much wanted them to define who they are for themselves. And it did come up that one of them defines themselves as American Mexican, which as a researcher, I might say, oh, that's a typo, but this was a direct quote. So giving space for folks to say how they identify was so important, especially on a pre-survey. And then in the interview, they went into that more in depth, which I thought was really cool. And then I got to analyze where that was coming from, et cetera. Annabelle, is that cool? Or do you want me to keep going? Annabelle? Okay. If anybody has questions, you pop them in the chat box or take yourself off mute. I'm happy to answer any questions.
You asked them about how they define their race and their ethnicity. Did you ask them how do they identify their gender?
Yes. So I asked for their gender and their gender, their sex, and then I never explicitly asked for their sexuality, but that came up, and almost 100% of my participants were queer, which I had no idea. Not even a little bit. Most folks were cisgender. I think only one identify as non-binary.
Do you have easy access to read a couple of your themes from your results? Yeah, read a couple of your themes. So she's talked so much and so well about how she got their stories, and then she started talking about how she analyzed these stories. But let's hear a couple of the results.
Yeah. Did somebody else have a question too?
I heard you say, if I heard correctly, that a lot of folks found validation, or they felt a lot of people who were not white were able to find validation on social media. Is that correct?
Yep. So
I just would be interested to hear, because particularly with younger people, I'm a millennial, but particularly with Gen Z, there's a lot about how their self-esteem can be affected by social media. So I would just be interested to hear some of their thoughts on that. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had the same assumption and teaching. So I put my major theme results screen up. This is from my FOR slideshow. So one of the things that came up pretty consistently was this idea of social media addiction and detox. So it's not necessarily that their self-esteem or the way they view themselves is affected. It's that they find when they are feeling like it is impacting them negatively, they start to take a detox, and they can recognize that they have addiction like tendencies with social media. Some of them talked about body image and body positivity versus negative body image. That was actually the most interesting between two women of color, a Black woman and a brown woman. One of them talked a lot about, she talked a lot about how she went to social media to see curvy, thick women like herself. And the other one talked about how she didn't feel enough to be a brown woman because she's smaller framed. She's not very curvy. And they talked about the competing nature of that within themselves. Like, how do I fit? So some of the other results were this idea of deepened understanding of race, the idea of not feeling enough. That came up. All of my mixed race folks talked about not feeling enough for either race or any of their races, and how their assumed and perceived identities were taken and people just made them choose. That came up a lot, how they felt like I have to choose either being Japanese or being Mexican. And you don't have to choose, but the way you show up in spaces and the assumptions others make about you was very impactful to them. And that literature around multiracial, biracial folks is very sparse. I had to go back many, many years to the 90s. The book is like right behind me somewhere. there's not a lot because people aren't talking about it. Because especially when you are studying folks, we ask them for like 2 or more races, but we don't ask people to identify or say what they believe their experience is. And I think it's really important, especially with this study, to not define them the way I see them. So I had one student, she looks like me, like perceived or assumed white, but she actually is Latinx. So her experience was one that was white assuming, or people call it white passing. I try to stay away from that language because it's assuming. So she was ostracized by her brown community, but her experience is living in a white world because that's how people assume she identifies. So she never felt like enough. She had a lot of stuff going on. She was an 1.5-hour interview. Queer identity came up a lot. This idea of social media as education versus validation, and then the different platforms. Facebook is dead to this group. It is more me, millennial and up. Political engagement, which we saw in this particular election, that politics and being engaged on social media is really important. Annabelle, did you want me to show quotes?
No, I think we're good. And
Okay, cool.
I think we're out of time, but
Perfect.
yeah, great job. So my heart is so full listening to you.
And if
Yeah.
anybody has questions or needs anything around this topic or wants to talk, please feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat, my personal email, because I love talking about this.
Yeah, and is it published on ProQuest right now?
It is.
Okay, we'll send you links to the dissertations that are up right now. Our next illustrious panelist is Dr. Perez.
Oh my goodness, so much pressure. Hi everyone, my name's Adriana. Annabelle guided me through this. We finished in 2019, and I always say, thank God I finished before the pandemic started, because there's no way I would have finished during the pandemic. Let's see, let me get you. And if I go too deep in, Annabelle, just let me know, because you know me and I can talk about this forever. My whole thing was about stories leaders tell. Why is this not working? Come on. I've spent the past 2 decades of my life in the space of leadership development, and that's what was driving this. If you look at leadership development throughout enterprises, it's a considerable spend. We don't really know how to really develop leaders, and there's a boatload of literature on that. And one of the things that is coming up more and more and more is the use of stories. And so my question was, what stories do successful executives of a large medical institution tell of the moments in their careers that define their leadership approach? Behind the scenes, what you should know is I work for one of the largest New York City hospitals. We have over 45,000 employees. And so that was where I was going to do my research. I ended up speaking with 13 leaders at what I was calling the upper levels, which were vice presidents and senior vice presidents within the enterprise, both in clinical and non-clinical environments. Some of them had been at the enterprise for 5 years. Some of them had been at the enterprise for 35, I think was the longest that I spoke with. My interviews were between 60 and 90 minutes. And so that was my population. While I was doing the narrative inquiry, one of the things that I was very well aware of and that I wanted to make sure that I remained cognizant of throughout this whole thing was the voice of the researcher, and how my voice was bound to seep in into the final writings, right? Which is something that is spoken about a lot in the literature. We had to select the stories. Well, actually the stories were selected by the people through the questions that I asked. And then there comes a whole part of, as a researcher, what are the results that you're finding, and how are you interpreting them? And to Annabelle's earlier point, I was based on this whole idea of stories as a way of knowing and as a way of learning. So as I said, I recorded them. I did not have notes. Victoria, you're much braver than I am. I didn't trust myself to have notes, because then I would write instead of look at them. So I recorded all of them. I paid someone to transcribe them. And then I read through them all, and I listened to them again. I wish I could find my papers. I just moved and I can't find them. I would have shown them to you. Highlighted parts in those interviews that felt salient, and then looked at what were the codes and the key phrases that I was looking at. And then that led to broader categories, which then looked at which quotes tied to these. And then I had to analyze it by frequency. And I know this is an eye chart, but this is one of the many Excel worksheets that I used to capture everything that I had. Right, so at the very top, you see their aliases. After I identified them, I created an alias chart, and I never looked at their real name again, so that I was trying to limit my bias because I know these people. And so if you look here at the bottom, these were some of the tabs that I was ending up with. The raw data is this one. These were just the salient quotes that I had highlighted from the interviews. And then, similar to what Victoria did, I ended up doing color coding. And so I had all quotes that had to do with learn and learning were then in a separate worksheet, and they were all like blue, I think. And using my voice and speaking up had another color. And so that's kind of how I started to sort it out. It was done in Excel, as I said. There were a lot of Post-its everywhere, all over the living room for a while. As I started reading through them, 3 key things kept coming up in all of the 13. And it was a whole idea of doubt or self-criticism. Were they really ready to become a leader? The moment when they felt that their voice was being heard and they had earned their seat at the table. And then the other major one was becoming a leader of others. And so this is then another one. This, as you can tell, this one's called my idea summary. So here are my aliases, once again. Here were their roles. Were they for just one campus or for the entire enterprise, how long they had been here, how many employees reported to them. And then these were some of the key messages that came out of every single one of them. If there were additional things that they had said, they ended up on this extra one. So for example, one of them is a Cuban immigrant. One of them, Jet, who had, in my mind, the largest heart of them all. As soon as I turned off the mic, he literally looked up at me and said, I shouldn't be here. One of these days, they're going to know that I'm not good enough at this. And yet he is in charge of bringing in millions of dollars from our donors, right? And recognized by many as an extremely successful leader. So it was interesting to say what they would see off mic and on mic. Jacob, for example, off mic said, well, I never tell anyone how old I am because I don't want them to think that I'm not good enough for this job or ready for this job. So I thought that was really interesting. Karina actually off mic said, women are bullies. And I never really had a mentor, and hence mentoring is vital to me. And I see it as a vital part of success. And so then as I was looking through them, there's 6 major themes. These are the 6 major themes: learning as a true lifelong journey, finding their voice, making sure their message was heard, how these leaders have stepped up and they've taken their own seat at the table, how it was important to them to be listened, how there are lessons that they've learned early on in life from their parents growing up or from their grandparents, and how they all acknowledged that they had an inner critic. This is just an example of one of the many quotes. My dissertation is peppered with quotes, obviously. These 2 speak to the learning as a true lifelong journey, right? This is when I noticed I had to go back to school. And this is when I had my aha moment, because this propelled me to go further in my education. So this was kind of the examples of quotes that I was getting. There were 5 minor themes along the 6. Mentors, still important. Issues of class, gender, and race. The research happened during 2018. So this was before we saw as much conversations about race and equity as we're seeing now. Yet there was still talk of, there's still an opportunity to include more voices. Some cultural norms are still present. Someone said I was raised in a Catholic environment, and so I always think of who's at the table before I speak, and is it my turn to speak or not? And then as they have moved up, they've experienced an increased sense of loneliness, right? And which I think is an adage that's well known in leadership development, that it's always lonelier at the top. So these are some of the examples in issues of class and gender. I know my privilege. I can walk into a place in my suit and I get treated very well. And I recognize that if I'm not in my suit, it's different. So is that race or class? And I never answered these questions. I let them speak. And like Victoria, I embraced silence. They weren't quiet for long, and just let them speak about their stories. These were 5 outliers that I found that I thought were interesting and that I wanted to make sure I captured. One of them was about an authentic leader or servant leadership. One of them, or actually these 5 outliers were mentioned by a couple of them, but there were not enough to make it as a major theme or a minor theme. So it was about communication, about bullying, about being kind, and about being willing to disclose fears around them. Right? This one's about kinder approach, right? This one's about I always give success away and it comes back, which I thought was fascinating. This was the only person that, this person, Jet, had a really hard time talking about himself. It was always my team, my group. And I was like, Jet, I want to hear about you. Like, tell me more about you. He's like, no, I'm not the important one here. It's my team. And I was like, yeah, your team is great. And I want to hear more about why are you where you are? And so this is where these major themes and minor themes fit. If you remember, I said that there were 3 key ideas that showed up throughout all the interviews: the self-criticism, their voice being heard and becoming enough, or leading others. And then the capital MTs are the major themes where they fit, right? So learning, and it fits with mentoring. Finding their voice fits with including voices, class, gender, and race, and cultural norms. Stepping up, being listened to, and their lessons in life, together with their inner critic and the talk of loneliness at the top. So this is just shown in list format. This is what they look when they're in longer sentences rather than in just a picture format. And then this is how it applies, because I kept thinking, okay, how do I use this back in the classroom to develop leaders? Bye, you'll remember this, systems theory from Bronfenbrenner, which we learned at the very beginning of our fielding journey. And then how it tied back to results-based leadership, which is, to me, an interpretation of Bronfenbrenner in practitioner life, or more commonly spoken about in non-academic circles. And so then what's still there to find out, right? And these were things that are still unclear. Are these results applicable elsewhere? Can we apply proto-stories? There's a lot of literature coming out of Israel about how there's core stories in leadership, and most of the stories that are out there fit into these stories. And then, do current environments support both storytelling and story catching, which is, do we have enough story catchers out there, which are the people that can come and literally catch the stories as they're being told and then share them with others and use them to develop others? And then how do we use this in the learning environment, right? And it goes back to story catchers. Can we have story building schemas? Can we have stories to use for influencing and trust building? And can we teach people how to tell stories and use that as a way to develop leaders in a more broader format throughout the enterprise? And then, yep, how do we use it, right? Because the conversation of confidence and competence keeps going along. It's this whole conversation around talent management within the enterprise. Do you build talent? Do you buy talent? And I think that is it. I know I spoke a lot and I spoke really fast. But are there any questions that I can answer?
You're from New York, so what do we expect, right?
Yeah, I'm dressed in gray, which is very colorful for me.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, this is Drew in Chicago, and I'm wondering, when you talked about your outliers, obviously they were present enough for you to name them and talk about them, and I'm wondering what about them, servant leadership, for example, kept popping up that caught your attention. And as a follow-up, before I get there, is it worth looking into more deeply, do you think?
Yes and yes. So servant leadership had shown up. I took away the slides that talked about the lit research, the literary reviews that I had done, because servant leadership and then the leader member exchange theory had been part of what I had put within my whole frame of literature. And this particular leader actually refers to himself often as a servant leader. And he's the only one that actually used the word love in his interview. He said leaders must love the people that they're leading, and it's until we treat everyone with love that we will get to where we want to get. And so for him, servant leadership is how he defines his leadership style. And as we talked about the stories that got him to where he is now, the whole idea of servant leadership kept coming up and up and up. He actually started life as a bellboy in a luxury hotel and now runs one of our largest campuses. Did I answer your question, Drew? Maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, Drew, you're muted.
Yes,
Well, I think
the aspects of servant leadership show up in any of the other interviews that you were able to identify?
They showed up in 2, and that's why they didn't make it as a minor theme. They were an outlier. And if this one leader, now that I look back on it, a year and a half afterwards, if this leader probably had not used it as such a big definition of who he is, then it probably would not have even made it into my outliers. But I had put a mark that you had to be named by at least 2. If this was mentioned by 2 people, at least, it was an outlier. 3 or more would make me start looking into, was this a minor theme? And 6 or more was what put me into the major theme category. So I recognize that that's an extremely arbitrary line of where to divide it, but I had to find a place, otherwise I was going to end up with way too many themes to discuss.
I understand.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And you can see
Thank
the
you,
detail.
Annabelle.
Yeah, you can see the detail that goes in to the data analysis part, reading and rereading. And you can also see how these stories are evoked, how both of the researchers so far, Dr. Verleza and Dr. Perez, really were able to evoke rich description. And now I'll turn it over to almost Dr. Elliott.
Oh my goodness, that was quick. Okay. I'll share my screen.
Pressure's on.
So I'm almost Dr. Elliott. Thank you, Annabelle, for allowing me to speak this morning. I studied organizational leaders who self-reported a spiritual transformation for a couple of reasons. One, I have a strong passion around spirituality in the workplace. It is a passion of mine that started right after I finished undergrad, which was in 1990. So you can do the math on actually how long ago that was. And since then, I'd had experiences in the workplace where I witnessed leaders who were different, meaning that they were not exotic or quirky or weird, but they moved and had their way in the workplace with people and their approach to work. Fast forwarding later on in my career, decided at one point to try my hand at a consultant practice that focused on working with organizations who were interested in spirituality in the workplace, and kind of, I call it Forrest Gumped my way around what type of organizations would these be. In that bumping and bumping up against my curiosity, meeting researchers in the field of spirituality in the workplace, and ended up at Fielding to study it from the lens of OD and change. The other aspect of me is that I have a theater background. And in theater, you learn or you bring forth what? Stories, right? And I always had a capability, if you will, of telling stories, whether it was telling the story of a character or telling the story itself. Also, being African-American, I come from a rich tradition of women in my family who tell stories. I joke about this because my nephew did not know that part of our lineage included an Irish slave master. And so every St. Patrick's Day, we say a salute to Mr. McKibbins. And he said, "Is this in a fact book?" And I said, "There's no fact book on this guy. We know this through oral tradition because our great grandmother was his woman, if you will. And this was just story that passed down on my mother's father's side of the family. So story is embedded in who it is I am. I wanted to take story and I wanted to take my passion around workplace spirituality and look at how I could approach organizational leaders who have had a spiritual transformation and their approach to leadership because of those transformations. Out of the data came 7 themes and 3 outliers. And I will talk about my themes and outliers in a second. I'm glad that that was raised as a question. I also interviewed, because this was last year and we were in COVID, the good news of COVID is that I heavily use technology via social media to find participants and also Zoom to have interviews with participants. I had an opportunity to interview people from various backgrounds, education, religions, spiritual beliefs. I also ended up talking to them early on in their biographical questions, just to make sure they were fitting what was needed in order to answer the research question. I'll skip to this in my recruitment here. As you can see, I had 43 interviews. There were biographical questions. And then from there were opening questions. And then there were 13 main interview questions. So for an example, there were people who I interviewed who had, I will say, colorful spiritual transformations, but were not leaders. They said, well, I sit on this board and I'm on this committee and I have a family and we're all leaders. Well, I was looking for people who had spiritual transformations, who actually had people reporting to them in the workplace. Or I had people who were actual leaders, had people reporting to them in the workplace, but asked me, well, how are you defining spiritual transformation? Well, what do you mean by that? And so part of my lit review, I will say, which I don't have in this presentation, is that I did talk a little bit about religious conversion versus spiritual transformation. I wasn't interested in the person who got married and became Jewish because their husband was Jewish or Catholic or whatever that was, because I was more interested in defining what spirituality was for them and what transformation that they had and their approach to leadership because of it. So I have to say, I will pause here to really thank Annabelle for helping me nail down this research question, because I didn't realize how much really having the research question and having those variables in the research question, because when you start talking to people, you will have all shades of gray around your research question, and you have to decide who it is going to be selected as your participant in your research. It's one thing to talk to someone, and this is no joke, who told me about dragons coming out the sea and all of these dreams and how he dated a Wiccan priestess who tried to kill him. And his role was mediator. He was a professional mediator and didn't have anyone reporting to him. Well, his stories were fantastical, but had nothing to do with my research question. Here are some of the sample questions that I had. I tried to make them open questions, but it's like, can you tell me about a significant episode or memory that stands out for you about your spiritual transformation? How about the first time you thought of yourself as changed spiritually, whether you had the title or not? The title meaning leadership title. Where were you? And then another one was, can you share with me a moment in time when you felt the integration of your spirituality and leadership? And those 3 questions, I will say I had 13, but those 3 questions for me If you could not pinpoint those or have some type of dialogue around these 3 questions, you kind of got kicked out of my, you got kicked out of my list of good participants. I will say though, with the question around spiritual transformation, what I was finding was that I walked into this research thinking a leader would tell me about one spiritual transformation that changed their lives. And in actuality, because of storytelling, I was able to gather maybe 3 or 4 different episodes in their lives that they thought, you know, I didn't realize this thing that happened when I was 14, or this memory I had when I was 22, or because I sat in meditation. I always sit in meditation. For some reason, when I sat in meditation this day and came out of that meditation, all these things started happening in my life. And I didn't want to change how all these things were happening. So I started integrating that way of being in my workplace too, because it was important for me to be authentic. So those are some of the things that were coming out of those stories. What I did around the process of this, because I get that spirituality and religion are big buckets for people. And people typically go, well, how do you create a container around this conversation so that you get the research that you need? I mentioned before, technology was my friend. All of my recruitment came out of LinkedIn, Facebook, and referrals of other people. I sent out emails with a flyer to let people know who I was looking for and why, and what were the requirements. Once people emailed me back saying, hey, I'm interested in this, and there were 43 people, I had to send them the IRB notice and some key questions that I wanted them to answer for me before we continued our conversations. And then even if they didn't answer them quite the way I wanted, I was still curious about them. So I went ahead and interviewed them just to validate whether or not that they were a good participant for my research. I interviewed them through Zoom. Zoom does do transcripts. I prefer not to use them. So I actually found a software called Trint, Trint. And I was able to take literally the Zoom interviews and upload the Zoom interviews to this software. And it provided me a transcript that looked maybe 5 times better than the Zoom. It wasn't perfect, but it gave me the transcripts that I needed. They will let you do, by the way, I think 7 for free. And then after that, you have to pay. Just so you know. and then I went into coding. I used Deduce. I did ask around. I'm part of the Paradigm Shifters. I don't know. I think I saw one person on who's part of the Paradigm Shifters. And I went to my group and said, hey, what are people using to code qualitative information? So people gave me all kinds of suggestions. I decided to go with Deduce, Dedoose. Here are a couple of reasons. Deduce will give you free 30 days. If you buy their book, I'm a book person. If you buy their book, you get an extra 2 months for free. So I knew that I was going to be doing research for the next 60 days, meaning I wanted to upload transcripts. I needed to code. I needed to go back and look at Zoom interviews, put more things in. So I figured 90 days for free on Deduce was a good deal. So I strongly suggest that. With the coding, I had coding, categories, themes, and outliers. Now this is a Post-it note version as visuals. This isn't what I did. I did this. And here, as you can see, this is not samples of my work. This is samples of Deduce screenshots, just so you know. I uploaded my transcripts and I started coding. And Annabelle was gracious enough to show me how to code, and we called it Code on the Go for all of my transcripts. And as you can see, I don't know if I can't make that any bigger, but in coding, it will give you color codes for your different themes or different things that are coming up. Now, initially, I ended up coding the bazooka out of pages. And I thought, I got way too many rainbows on these pages. I need to go back and look at whether or not these things are codes. You're not doing it wrong. It just means that you're doing it so you can really understand your work. So I thought that was the wrong way. And actually, I felt like that was the right way, to keep rereading what I was coding, and also going back to those Zoom interviews, listening to those Zoom interviews and coding while I was listening to the Zoom interviews. The other thing what happens in Deduce, they give you a code tree. So what happens is that as I started coding some things, I ended up coming up with categories. Deduce calls them code trees. Well, what these code trees did were I aligned my code trees with each question, so that now as I'm looking at my responses to questions, that I'm looking at all of these codes, now I can begin to move around and go, well, this is really a category here. This is really a category here. As I start creating categories, all of a sudden I had themes. Now at the bottom of this presentation page, I'm showing you a home page. And again, this is just an example. Don't let all of this intimidate you. I use maybe half of it here, but what it does is it lets you know you can also weight your codes. You can determine whether or not which codes were more significant than others. It'll give you the word phrasing. I don't know if you see this here. It'll give you, I forget what that's called. It'll also give you Venn diagrams, anything that you need that will show you your work, qualitative. It also does quantitative too, but my focus was qualitative. Here are my themes. There ended up being 7 themes and 3 outliers. I debated whether or not I wanted to do major themes and minor themes, but I thought having minor themes would make this work convoluted. And it was very important for me, because I was talking about spirituality and blending it with leadership, that I had clear-cut themes. My themes, I took Adriana's approach, was that I had ended up with 12 participants. I had to have at least six people, participants, talk about a theme or categories before it became a theme. With my outliers, these were people who talked about these themes, but there were 3 or less. I struggled with the top theme, meditation, for a couple of reasons. One, because I am a meditator and I love meditation. I love silence. And I really, really, really wanted to make meditation a theme. And thank goodness for research. Thank goodness for using a platform, a software platform, where I can go back, look at my codes. Am I missing something around meditation? No, I wasn't. There were only 2-3 people who talked about meditation. And so I could not make it a theme, even though it was something personal to me that I love. And those are my 7 themes. And having them come to life, and Annabelle kind of gauged me here on time. These were the definitions.
Yeah, we're about at time, so.
Okay. Are there any questions? I can take questions as I move through.
Yeah, she's showing you some specifics on her themes now.
No, this is Drew. I wonder, thanks, very interesting work. I appreciate your preparing this for our session. When you introduced the notion of spirituality, were you often asked, how do you define it? And when you were, how did you?
I wasn't asked how I defined it, which was interesting. I was asked only by people who were struggling with the question themselves and did not end up being participants for other reasons. I did in my lit review talk about spirituality, and I talked about spirituality versus religion. I will say, just for the sake of this presentation, that spirituality is personal. It's about belonging to something bigger or greater than themselves. And religion for me is more about membership. And looking at text and rules and regs that are guiding your life to move you to your spirituality. I had one person who is Buddhist who said it was like fingers pointing to the moon, if you will. Fingers being religion and the moon being spirituality. And that was a way of kind of guiding people through that conversation around spirituality and religion.
So this is Tricia Ulrich. Did you find a connection between spirituality and good leadership or positive leadership?
Now, that's interesting because I would never think about leadership as being good. I will say positive in the sense that what I was hearing in the conversations were people who were, again, if we looked at my outliers, people who created trust among the people that they were leading, and also people who made decisions that were not about them as in ego decisions, but made decisions that were for the good and the benefit of all, eco decisions. So I would categorize it that way versus good or positive.
Right. Yeah, we didn't really get a chance to absorb your results, because we ran out of time. I would be interested in seeing what your results were.
Sure. I'm of the opinion that good is depending on what side of the stick you're on.
Well, yeah, and I'm not sure good was the right word, but
Yeah.
I think in the breakout I told you, and I sent you a link to that Princeton Faith and Work initiative. So I've heard some of the CEOs in the area talk about how spirituality has impacted their decision making and provided them a platform. I think one of your outcomes kind of relates to that. It provided them a platform for how to go about making the best decisions. So that's kind of what I was.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And we could spend hours on each of these pieces of research. They're so amazing. And I think it's kind of interesting to see the overlap in some of the themes from Adriana's and also from Lisa's. So we'll move on now to doctoral candidate, Maine Castro. Maine, are you with us? There we go.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is just a brief background, what drove me to doing this research. So basically I worked in a prison and as a substance abuse counselor. And I was, intimidated working for the prison, and it was very difficult for me to figure out how was I going to make this connection with these people that came from different backgrounds, different offenses. I was paralyzed. So
Maine, excuse me, can you make this full screen, your PowerPoint?
Oh. How do I do that?
Well, are you in PowerPoint? Usually there's a little
yeah, I'm looking, but I can't
down
find
at the very bottom. There should be like a TV screen on the very bottom. If not, it's fine. Ignore me. Oh, there you go. You did it.
Okay, thank you. So, so I had to reach inside my heart and figure out how would I connect with prisoners. And it was going back to my cultural practice, which was talk stories. And so I'm gonna, let me see. So talk story, a narrative approach to healing. Now I'm doing this because I was learning as I was doing this research. So anyway, so talk story in Hawaiian is kupa kupa, which means that's talk story. It's a Hawaiian interpretation for communicating and relating. It's flexible, open, non-judgmental, and it's interactive. It's an exchanging gifts of knowledge. And it is puhu'nua. That's the setting I wanted to create a safe place for healing. And it's personal and intimate. So Talkstar was a strategy that I use for connecting, to seek all voices and perspectives. Sorry, I'm trying to move this here. Listening to undertones in their words, phrases, and sentences, understanding the thoughts and ideas in a broader context, sense making of the individual's past, present, and hope for the future. So, you know, our kapunas teach us to respect to one another. So mutual respect was very important in this interview. And acceptance and conditional worth is emphasized while keeping an open mind regardless of a person's history. So, I'm sorry. So the population of interest, of course, was prisoners, persons incarcerated in prison for 3 years and beyond, persons post-release in a community for 3 months at least, persons 21 years and older, a person who has not committed new offenses within the 6 months of their release from prison. This is a snapshot of the individuals that I interviewed. Their length of incarceration, the longest someone was in prison was 23 years and 4 months. The least, I believe it was 3 years. So my question was, if recidivism is directly affected by post-prison reintegration and adjustment, how do individuals try to make their lives work during post-incarceration? I've read numerous of literature about all the reasons why they recidivate, but I was very interested about how are these individuals managed to not recidivate. I wanted to dive in and out of curiosity, find that out. So narrative inquiry in human sciences, why narrative? To understand the phenomena, to explore and capitalize human experience, and the aim for an in-depth exploration, basically just which traditional empirical research methods cannot sufficiently address issues such as complexity, multiplicity of perspectives, and human-centeredness. Am I going too fast, Annabelle? Okay, because I'm kind of nervous.
No,
right
you're
now.
doing good. You're doing good. Keep going.
Okay, the method is a mean to answering the research question. How does Talkstar facilitate support in the lives of post-incarcerated individuals who try to make their lives work and not recidivate? Their voice, their story. Thinking narrative, the process. Okay, so this is the process that I went through, and it was painstaking. So first, recruitment was snowball sampling. You know, it started with, I know someone, and then they connected me to that someone, and then contact is made, and then we, you know, schedule for a meeting. Informed consent process was signed, and I have to say I had to send this out via email attachment because that's when the pandemic started, and you know, it wouldn't be the face-to-face thing that I had initially had planned. I had an interview protocol. This was absolutely important for me to avoid the risk of making the human process mechanical. I didn't want it to be you know, I just wanted it to be as humanly possible. I wanted it to be comfortable. I wanted it to be organic. So small talk before the big talk. I wasn't going to go into this interview and just, oh, by the way, I have, you know, I wanted it to be like a get to know. Small talk is, how are you? How's things going on with you? Are you comfortable? Everything is okay. You know, pretty much that's the talk story before the big talk. Talk story is a relationship. I had the guiding questions to establish the focus. And at the end of each interview, I asked permission in advance to follow up with the participant if I needed clarification. I wanted that open door. Or if I had a question that popped up that I wasn't able to ask then, I was able to come back, and they were all great. They said, yeah, sure. So I had 15 questions, but the guiding key question is this too. What were your thoughts when you were first released out in the community? And what strategies did you use to keep from going back to prison? Now, these 2 questions opened up the doors. It answered all my questions, and it was a conversation. When they would tell me something, I would follow up with a direct question, like, and how was it? How was that for you? What did that feel like? So that is how the ball kept rolling for the questions that I needed, the answers I needed for my questions. So Talking Stories by audio, video. My first 3 interviews was done separately, face-to-face. That was before the pandemic. And that was in February. And I was able to capture their facial expressions doing the face-to-face. I was able to witness them crying. I was able to really embrace everything that you would see face-to-face. And I was worried when the pandemic came, if I was going to capture that richness over the video, you know, by Zoom or FaceTime. That's the 2 options that they have. And I was really surprised because I was able to go inside their personal space. So my talk stars with individuals were in the living room, in their bedroom, how I was able to witness their interaction with their children, with their partners, and it was this bonding. I was able to just capture all of that. But it was also a balance act. You know, I was going with the flow per se. So finding of the data analysis, Makahana Ike, knowledge is gained by doing. And that's basically what I did. Sorry. So this is what I did after I got the data. I'm collecting the data. I listened to the interview tapes prior to the transcription. I transcribed, and I did it all manually. I transcribed all the tapes, read the transcripts and observational notes, and kept the 3 main groups that I kept was the memos, category strategies, connecting strategies. So this is what I did, journaling. I wrote notes and memos from start to finish. I'm visual, so I needed to see what I was doing because there was so many information. So that was my step, reading the transcripts. Step 2, coding. And as I said, I did manual. I did try the MaxQDA. I love it, but I was also trying to learn it. And I also felt like as I was learning, it was taking me away from what I really needed to do. It took away from the raw information. So I said, hell with MaxQDA. I'm gonna do things by manually. So that's what I did. Now, there were so many codes out there and I had to refine it. I needed it to reduce it, but I was so afraid that if I reduce it, that it would take away from the richness, but I managed to work it out. So this was deciding which codes are important. And then I kind of cleaned it up a little bit. And I also used what Adriana did was Excel that helped me to sort out my my codes, my themes. And again, I'm so visual, and these are my buckets where I started to say, okay, what is they're talking about? And then I started to put things together, you know, underneath each bucket. Throughout our talk story, I didn't expect the participants to open out, you know, I mean, the themes that came up were emotional, rich information, and I didn't expect that from ex-prisoners. They were so open and so vulnerable, and they weren't afraid to express their emotions. You know, it was heartwarming all throughout the interview. So the reintroduction to society, these are the stuff that came out of the interview. Before, when they were introduced back to society, pray for protection, freedom, relief, and eating at McDonald's. Shocked, I could not believe it. The shock I could not believe it was from an ex-inmate who was actually a lifer, and he was sentenced to life in prison. So this was a shock for him that he was able to be released. So he was shocked. It was 23 years later. So this is what came out of the interview when I asked what was, you know, their first thought when they came off, when they stepped ground on the freedom. They had expectations. I thought that I would do my best. I thought I was going to walk in and assume the role that I had before. I thought. It was, I thought this, I wish this, and I prayed for this. So there was a lot of expectations and hopes, which was also delusional for some of them. So this is what I mean when I say expectations, changing plans, disappointments, blurred, disillusioned, and it was just a honeymoon. They once said it was just like a honeymoon. Just when I really thought things was going to work out, and it didn't. So I'm missing one. So then it seemed like they came to a realization. They struggled. They had so much struggle, so many barriers. Just everything just was overwhelming, that they came to a realization, and they started to make choices and decisions. And then they knew that they had to adapt and change to reintegrate back into the community. They had to make changes. I'm hoping this is the correct slides, because something's missing in here.
People say, well, you can't do the same things in the U.S.
Yeah,
have diversity. Okay, they do have some diversity, an increasing amount. They have a lot of.
Wait,
Someone
needs to be muted here. We're getting back feed from someone. Okay, keep going, Maine.
Okay.
Maine, the slide that you had was adapted change. It had 2 Hawaiian words. Now your slide says thoughts and emotions.
That's interesting. Well, let me just keep going. So in all this interview, like I said, the themes came up were emotionally rich. There were so many things going on inside of them. To be out in the community, they were feeling discouraged, they felt overwhelmed. I can't cope. They were paranoid. There's just all this noise in their life as they try to move forward and have their own life. But it was all this noise that keeps putting them down. And I could totally understand with one of them saying prison was waiting for them, because it's easier to go back to prison. So these are the category of themes that I was able to come up with that stood out for me. For theme 1, thoughts and emotions, feeling tense and uneasy. This is Kyle. I felt stupid. I went home and I cried to my mom. What he was released 2 days after he was released, he was standing in line at the bank to cash a check. And he had 2 people in front of him and several people in the back. And in the prison, he's been in prison for what, 15 years. You learn not to be close to anyone because somebody's going to false crack you. That's what he told me. And he said when he stood in line, he felt the person behind him, his breath against his back of his neck. And he was feeling really anxious and stressed. And he turned around and he said, "Hey, brah, you're standing too close to me." And he understood the guy didn't realize he was in prison and he just came out. And the guy looked at him with this expression, "Wow, what am I doing?" And the people in front of him turned around and say, "Hey, is everything okay? Is everything all right?" He said he was so overwhelmed with all the stimuli going on that he had to leave the bank, and he went home and he started to cry. He started crying and his mom asked, "What's going on?" And he said, "I just can't do this anymore. I just can't do it." And so this stood out to me when he was telling me, because I could see how difficult it was for him.
We're about at time, so maybe you can, these are pretty, already here, okay.
Yeah, so it was like a reset, and then they talked about self-care. Self-care, part of self-care was Ho'oponopono to make things right, and then they worked on their person. They worked it on themselves. They worked on activities to keep themselves going. They worked on their mind, changing thoughts, emotions, in managing their emotions, their ohana, making up with their ohana family, and realized that they had a responsibility. So, and their spirituality. And this is just briefly what the programs they felt would be supportive for them, for people that post-release. And this is pretty much how things ended up for me. And then thank you. So let me get.
Mahalo. Okay, we're all back. Whoa.
Sorry, I was so nervous. I was ready.
Yeah, can you turn your camera on so we can see you?
Great work.
There's Maine's coming and going. There she is. There she is.
Great work.
Thank you.
Okay, so we planned on going 2 hours, and my heart is so full with these 4 amazing scholars, and the depth of the work. You can see what happens in narrative if you truly get someone's story, the depth of what you hear. And I thought Maine's was quite good in that she had little snippets of what they actually said. Sometimes you can make your themes actually phrases from what people said. But I was going to go to groups, but I'm just thinking maybe we'll just open it up to questions for about 10 minutes across the 4 authors. Does that sound good? Yes, no, maybe. And everyone be mindful that there's a lot of people on the call, so we want to give space for everyone to talk and ask questions. So let's open it up. Maybe some people we haven't heard from yet. I know you're so dazzled by the amazingness of this work. Any questions?
Hello, Dr. Nelson.
Hi there.
This is Marisa Lombard. I'm from the University of Pretoria in the city of Tshwane in South Africa. So just want to say thank you so much for all the presenters. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm going to do my PhD by publication, which is something quite new to our university, and I'm using narrative inquiry. So I just want to say that this was a really, really informative session. I've really learned a lot, and just thank you for all the information. I'm looking forward to reading all the presenters' work and their dissertations. So yeah, just thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, well, we're so happy to have you with us, and to have doctoral candidates from other universities and other continents. Thank you.
It's only a pleasure.
Okay, we have a question from Dr. Is this Dr. Mitchell? Laura, is that you? There's a technique in before you code. I think a couple people mentioned bracketing. It actually comes from phenomenology, but I use it across all all of my trainees, research trainees, although now they are the scholar researchers, no longer trainees, but after you get your interviews, and qualitative data analysis is what we call an iterative process. You notice how they read and then they reread. And before coding, the idea of bracketing is you write out what you think you're going to get, because the criticism of qualitative epistemology is researchers just get what they think they're going to get, right? You're just looking for certain things and you interview and then you make those the themes. So bracketing is to make the unconscious bias of the researcher conscious. So then one starts coding, one knows what it's a conscious thing, what the assumptions are. So maybe researchers, did any of you bracket, and how did that work?
This is Lisa. Yes, I had to bracket because I think I mentioned in my presentation is that my love for meditation and my love for being silent. And so I had to make sure after every interview, really look at what it is I thought I heard, write down what I thought I heard, and then go back and start coding. And some people, if I want to give a level to the conversations, I really made an assumption that one person, I thought, oh, after listening to him, I'm like, oh, he's so spiritual, he's so wonderful. And then looking at the codes, I'm going, well, what made that spiritual? So I had to really write out what it is I thought I was looking for, and in particular people, and what I heard versus the coding itself. So it did work for me.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Elliott.
For me, I'm a pretty reflective person to begin with. And as a white woman engaging in racial justice work and engaging with people who are entrenched in their own racial identity, I had to understand my own racial identity development first, where a lot of white folks would say that we don't have a racial identity, but that is inaccurate. So I had to engage in my own work, which I've been doing for about 15 years. And then what was really interesting was I see everything from a race lens. I think everything everyone says is rooted in white supremacy and their own socialization. And I had to reset before every single interview and give myself 5 or 10 minutes because I needed to hear the whole story, not just from a race perspective. So I really had to open up myself as a lesbian to hear what people are saying in terms of their sexuality, their sex, their gender. I had to really open myself up to first gen. I had to open myself up to English as a second language. I really just had to crack myself open in order to allow that. A lot of my work came after the fact. I would set it aside and then go back, similarly to Lisa, and just, well, almost Dr. Elliott, pardon me, and just look at it again. So it takes a lot of actual like conscious effort, I found. I was very tired all of the time.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Verleza. I'm calling her Dr. Ellie now. Who cares about ProQuest, right? It's going up. It's just a technicality at fielding that you can't use PhD until the dissertation is actually published on ProQuest, but it's a technicality. So just for those not in fielding, I was giving that background. Victoria, thank you for saying that, because she bracketed before the interviews. You know, Lisa was talking about bracketing before coding. I know some people do a little ritual before an interview, like even meditate or light a candle. So that they clear their mind, because you are the, you're not doing a test, you're not using an assessment, a quantitative assessment. You are the instrument in qualitative research. So you have to make yourself an instrument of openness. Thank you for that question, Dr. Mitchell. I see Dr. Marr there. I hadn't seen him before. Hi, Dr. Marr. I was on his committee.
I have a question directed to Maine, who's one of the presenters.
Okay.
For me, your topic is so precious because you were interviewing people who who were re-entering society, who had re-entered society. So I'm wondering, in your storytelling, I felt like in mine with spirituality, and these people would tell me these stories, and some of them were heart-wrenching, that I had to create space between my Zoom interviews to just allow myself to release from those stories so I can be a fresh person open to hearing the next story. I'm wondering, in your process, Maine, did you have a similar experience where you had to separate yourself from those who were telling stories, and how did you keep your own balance in their storytelling?
So Talk Story in Hawaii, it's about sharing the emotion. So when I was touched and I felt really like sad, it was important for them to know that there was a connection. Like, I got them. I hear you. I hear your voice. I hear your pain. So it was important that they, you know, I mean, that I would not hide that. So I just went with the flow. I mean, I didn't just fall apart, but I wanted them to know, I hear you. I hear your voice. I hear your pain. And I think that gives them a safe setting. Like, she is real, she cares, and so I'm going to be me. And that's pretty much what I asked them to do. Do you, just be who you are. And that's how they were able to open up, I think, Lisa. It was really easy for me because that's a practice I've done forever, you know, in my culture. So it was like a balancing act in some cases, especially with someone who is institutionalized. So it was a little different with those particular in those particular incidents. Thank you for your question. I hope I answered your question.
You did. You did. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess someone's had the hand out. Lisa, hand up.
Yeah, thank you all for your inspiring work. Yeah, before I have to log on to another call along the lines of safe spaces and empathy, do you have maybe suggestions on how to create questions that frame in a way without imposing on the response of the individual, that leaves it to an open-ended answer, because or determining whether or not focus groups or individual interviews would be best, because I'm thinking about if people feel more comfortable within groups of the same gender or culture, or if you had a process for framing the questions or determining individual versus focus group interviews.
Let's see. Who wants to answer? I have a response, but does one of the the panelists have a response?
I was going to just offer my idea because I was asking them the story, how they would tell the story of their life. I wanted to do it one-on-one to create that safe space. And I started out I would actually tell them, like, let's get the easy questions out first, just to warm up, which is, how long have you been here? Blah, 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 blah. And then my first question was actually, what is your first memory? When was the first time you thought of yourself as a leader? Drag them all the way back. And then take it from there, all open-ended. And then to speak to the other question that was being asked, how did you prepare before? Because it's a big deal, right? The researcher is going to insert themselves into it, whether you want to or not, because you're human. And so I would tell myself before I walked into every single one of these, I would say, I'm walking in without memory or desire. It's not my story, it's their story. So I don't know if that helps.
It's helpful, thank you.
My committee actually went back and forth a lot. Annabelle can attest to this, in terms of doing group or individual. And initially I was going to do both. I wanted to do individual first, follow up with group after, but in the interest of time, space, and my own energy, it felt better to just do individual, and then I make the connections between. All of the students actually knew each other. So someone asked early in my presentation, how did I get participants? I luckily work on a college campus where I do a lot of public speaking, and I work with student leaders, and they happen to like me a lot. So I would just plug myself in my workshops and say, if anybody was interested, to email me, and it snowballed from there. So I had like 4 people interested, and then I ended up doing 17 interviews, and had COVID not happened, I probably would have increased to about 20. But they opened up more one-on-one.
Right. Thank you so much. This is excellent feedback. I used to be against focus groups and qualitative research, and I had a nonprofit, the Wheel Council, Holistic Health Education and Empowerment for Life, and we did substance abuse and HIV prevention clubs in downtown Phoenix with Mexican American young people. And we were doing, we hired an anthropologist from Arizona State University because we did a comadre program where the moms would come in, and they actually used the HIV prevention program. Some had not seen condoms before, and they wanted to see them. You know, we were told, oh, you can't do this in a Catholic community. But in any case, sorry, I'm a storyteller. This anthropologist said, oh, I think the madres would talk more with each other. And so she did focus groups, and she got very much rich description. So I think it depends on your research question and your participants. But you can, you know, what's the word? The gold standard of narrative interviews is rich description. And so you can try it out like with pilots. But I do have a website, AnnabelleNelson.com, and there's a grad student tab, and there's a lot of information on there. And there's a PowerPoint on setting up interviews. So this is just one slide from that. You know, you want to start with a warm up. You heard them all say that, right? You make someone comfortable. And then when you want to get people's stories, you don't want to use theoretical language. Like a lot of people try to use their research question in their interview protocol. No, no, no. But the hacks for interviewing in narrative are think about a time and tell me about a time. So you're trying to open the memory banks and get the story going on there. And you know if you're doing a good job, if you're getting rich description, if you're hearing their authentic voice. And also, this may sound, this is definitely on the constructivist continuum of being subjective, but you want resonance with their story and you. Like, does that story seem authentic? I see people nodding their heads. You want that resonance, that like clunk. Yeah, this is someone's story. You know when it happens. And then we talked about your interview stance, like since it's constructivist paradigm or epistemology, you're interacting with creating this knowledge. So you have to be really careful about how you're showing up. And we've talked about that. And we've talked about expecting emotions and journaling. And you want to create a safe setting. I mean, Maine did an exceptional job of talking about that, where it can go on for a little bit. Most qualitative interviews are 60 minutes, 90 minutes. And at the end of an interview, you always want to say, is there anything else you'd like to add? So I'll stop sharing if I can find my ribbon. Oh, this was, I do want to say on my website, there's internet, there's PowerPoints on how they're called content analysis, I think, the PowerPoint, but it has the step-by-step things that you saw people working through. And I will try to stop sharing. Let's see. Oh.
Hey, Annabelle.
Yep, go.
I just want to add that Rebecca has her hand up. And definitely utilize Annabelle's website. I give it to grad students that I mentor who don't even go to fielding all the time, who are specifically looking to do narrative. So if you can bookmark it. I'm not on that computer that has it. Otherwise I'd get it. I can find it actually.
It's just AnnabelleNelson.com, and my name is long, 2 A's, 2 N's, 2 E's, 2 L's, and only 1 B, but AnnabelleNelson.com. And then there's a grad student tab. You know, a lot of my background as psychologist is Jungian, so you can see a number of Jungian influences, but the grad student tab has lots of info for students. Okay, someone have the hand up? Did someone tell me?
Yeah, my name is Rebecca, and I'm actually from Central Michigan University. And someone shared your link with me because this is the first time I'm attempting to do narrative inquiry. All of my other studies have been quantitative, not qualitative, so it's scary for me. But my question for you is this, and that is, I understand now, listening to everyone speak, that an interview should last between 60 and 90 minutes. But I have started putting together questions, and I found that I started off with like 8 questions, and now I have like 17 questions. I know that that's too many. Like, what would be the right amount of questions to have to make sure I'm getting that rich description and jogging their memories appropriately, that isn't going to keep me there for 4 hours?
Yeah, so does the panel want to respond to that?
I can jump in. We also say this in coaching. If you are there and you are truly listening with your entire body, like you're not thinking about what you're going to ask next, you're just super there in the moment, the next question will appear. I know it sounds kooky, but the next question just shows itself. I had 20 questions on mine, and sometimes I used 20 and made up a couple, and sometimes I used 10, and that was enough to bring them back to moments and stories that they wanted to share with me about these defining moments. And as Annabelle said, I never asked them, what was a defining moment in your leadership career, right? It was just, when was the first time you felt like a leader? When was the first time someone called you a leader, right? So you can have them in the back of your mind. I had a list. I think I used my list once in my 13 interviews, because you know where you want the conversation, what you're trying to get out of them. I hope that helps.
I had between 15 and 20 also. And I think for some interviews, I did ask all. And in some interviews, I asked 2. So it really does depend on your participant, and are they ready to just dive deep and dive deep fast? But if you're really listening, you'll get the answers to all of your questions, and you know where you want to go. So you have your research question, but then you also have your guiding questions for yourself that their responses will fit in. I did tell them I had 3 buckets of questions I was asking, and told them there was no right or wrong, just talk to me. That's all I want. It's just you to talk to me. And that really helped them feel like they were contributing something, even though they didn't think they contributed much. So having 20 was just there.
Yeah, and I like what you just said, all of you, but you don't want them to go cognitive to try to figure out what you want, right? You don't want them to go cognitive to try to get the right answer. You can see students, in class when a teacher asks questions and they're all going, now, what does that teacher really want? So, and then also researchers, when you do a long lit review, if you're in dissertation, and so you have all these things in your head you want to know about. So sometimes I say to quiet the researcher is you can make a list of prompts over to the right. Like if nothing happens, I might want to ask that. So you have to kind of create an atmosphere in yourself where you're not getting the right answer. But I think 10 good questions is kind of a thing to think about. And then you can put a lot of prompts under the questions that you could go to in case something comes up. I haven't been monitoring the hands. Is anyone are there any hands up? Okay, Dr. Marr.
Thank you, guys. This has been great, being exposed to all this narrative. My question is about first-person narratives, or weaving a personal narrative into a dissertation. Has anybody seen any examples of that?
Sure. So I showed you the qualitative genres, and one is called autoethnography. And so that's all about an individual. And I do have, if you email me, I'll put my email. It's just Anna A. Nelson at Fielding is my email. I can send you examples of autoethnographies, but that's not really the, what we're presenting today. However, we often talk about reflexivity of the researcher, like they're changing as they're interviewed and you're changing as a researcher, right? Lisa's smiling. Lisa, you want to talk about reflexivity?
Yes. I started to do my presentation just on reflexivity for today because, Professor Dr. Fred Steyer got me there talking about reflexivity. And what kind of happened in the process was just, as my participants spoke more about their spiritual transformation and spoke more about how that was integrated in their leadership. It was kind of like, while my questions I knew would take us on a journey, I would find myself on a journey with them as well. And then found myself saying to them, oh, I've had this experience too. What do you mean by that? And then also I will say, how do I phrase this? I would say in reflexivity, there's this moment, at least in my experience, there was this moment where I needed to step out so that I'm getting them to answer the questions that are needed in order for the story to continue. For an example, and I'll just put an example out there, this didn't happen, but someone would say, and all of a sudden there was a blue hat. And I'll go, oh, a blue hat? Yes, a blue hat. And the blue hat did X, Y, and Z. And so we'd end up on these roundabout stories around, and I get very interested in it, but I'd have to pull myself out of it. So it becomes this dance, if you will, around how much I allowed myself to be taken on their journey, being mindful of my journey as well as a researcher. I hope that makes sense to people.
Yeah, and I often suggest researchers put in an epilogue of their dissertation, or what happened to you as a result. So yeah, you can definitely put in the first person.
There's one more thing, I'm sorry. The other thing that happened to me, I shouldn't say happened to me, was that if you recall, last year was a tricky, I don't want to say tricky, but a tough year for people of color. So what was happening with me was that I was unemployed and we were in the middle of a global pandemic. So I thought, great time to finish my dissertation, right? I'll just sit, I'll meditate and write, and I'll juice and I'll do yoga and write. Well, a couple of things happened called George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I have 3 brothers. And so I ended up in group chats with my brothers on the phone about what was going on with the police. And so I had a lot of mind clutter, if you will, going on in my head. And I felt like there had to be a way for me to separate my mind clutter so that I can actually have interviews with people and not bringing my beliefs or bringing my drama of the day into my interviews. It would be a disservice to the research and selfish of me to do that to people. The other thing that I found myself doing, because of all the conversations that were spiritual, I found myself deepening my own spiritual practice last year, because I felt like if I'm going to ask these questions of people to talk about spiritual transformations, I needed to be grounded in a way that my hearing, that I was hearing be beyond my ears, if that makes sense to people, that I was allowing my heart to hear what they were saying and then allowing my spirit to be open and receptive to what they were saying. So that was also part of my reflexivity. And I'll leave it at that, Annabelle.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, storytelling. I mean, we've overlapped narrative and storytelling here, but so narrative research is a genre of qualitative research, and the stories you get from people are narratives. So it's a genre, but it's also a data source. And we tap in the ancestral memory and ancestral traditions of humans in terms of story to get there. And I like what you said, Lisa, because stories come from the heart of the teller to the heart of the listener. So the emotional content in stories makes them so rich. But I think we're at time. I want to thank our visitors that aren't from the fielding community. That's so exciting. You know, we have people from different continents and different universities, like Rebecca. Can you, I mean, I can't see everybody. If you're from a different university, can you wave? Look at this. Look at this. I'm seeing these waves. Okay, and then we have many alums like Dr. Curran, Dr. Zarins. I never got your name right, Beba, but we have a bunch of alums. Yeah, the Beverly's alum. Wave if you're.
That's someone right Northwestern.
Yeah.
My bachelor's Northwestern. So
Then we have Dr. McQueen, we have Dr. Lathrop, and it looks like Dr. Lathrop has his own organization on Story, which is exciting. But thank you so much, and we will be sending you contact information. At least 2 of the dissertations are in ProQuest, and Lisa's will be soon. So we'll be sending you those links as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. Something that we all love, narrative and story.
Annabelle, thanks for pulling us together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
Very special.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Stay safe.
Thank y'all.
Thank you,
Bye.
Professor. This
Thank
is
you
Wanda.
much.
Thank you, Professor. This
Yeah.
is
Thank you
Wanda.
much.
Bye. Thanks so
hey,
much.
Wanda. Oh, Wanda.
It was
Very-
great. It was
very
great.
Thank you for
informative.
everything.
Thank you.
Point of parade, you do that. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, Adriana. I don't know if we're still on there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful.
All right.
I want more.
I
want
know, me
more.
too.
Okay.
Love you.
Love you too. Bye.